Hello. In this lesson, the focus is going to be about Brexit, but also about the idea of Europe as divided. It's important when we study EU law and the EU in general to recognise that the EU isn't this homogenous thing. It's a collection of, obviously, 27, 28 member states. But Europe is a very split continent, and it's split in various ways. And so part of what the EU has to deal with is, of course, its primary mission of creating an ever closer union for the peoples of Europe, but recognizing that the peoples of Europe are not the same, and that these differences need to be reconciled while moving towards this union of a single set of laws, of a certain combination of policy. And so I'm going to explore a few divisions and then talk about Brexit. So, one way that we can see the EU is split is between East and West. It's important to remember that the EU existed some 30 years before the fall of the Soviet Union, and yet now it includes various countries which were a part of the Soviet Union. So, when we think of the West of Europe, we think of a set of countries which has historically been capitalist, whereas, only 25 years ago, many countries in the east of Europe were socialist, communist. And so this comes with a variety of differences between these east and west states. One is perhaps different living standards, different wages. And so if we're going to have free movement, how is it that we reconcile these different wages and living standards with the idea that workers can move freely across borders, earn higher wages, and potentially move back? Whether or not this is a problem in reality is up for debate, but it's certainly one we need to think about, at least in theory. There's also the idea that different member states might have a different conception of what the state ought to do. It's not to be taken for granted that the state should do some things and not others. Indeed, this is very much a key debate in politics more generally. But when we consider the histories of different countries in Europe, and indeed the present state, where it is they're going towards, it's not straightforward that they see the state as doing one thing and not as another. And the job of the EU is, to some extent, to put forward a certain vision of the state and to put forward a unifying set of laws. But we also need to interrogate the idea of East and West. The whole notion of borders, and particularly the contrast between East and West, is one which historically is more about politics than geography. And so maybe we need to think about Western snobbishness as directed towards Eastern Europe, if indeed Eastern Europe is this defined set of states, or whether or not it's just a political concept which we use to group together states which aren't similar to the West. And then the economic consideration of creditor and debtor states. The Euro crisis has exposed a massive difference between states which owe lots of money and states which are the home, mostly to banks, who are owed a lot of money. And we see the result of the Euro crisis being that countries such as Greece and Spain have had, especially Greece, have had austerity, have had lower government spending, cuts enforced on them. And one way of thinking about this is that some member states feel and identify as European in a different way to others. For a Greek person, for a Greek pensioner in particular, a Greek pensioner associates the EU with a fall in their pension. And while it is the case that Germany, the UK, France, Belgium, those countries are also within the EU affects them in a very different way. And we need to interrogate whether it is the case that the EU can actually be seen as a body separate from its states, as one thing, because actually what we see is that the EU can mean different things to different states, and different states feel the EU in different ways. A German citizen might see the EU as a provider of opportunities, whereas a Greek pensioner might see the EU as taking opportunities away. And this is something we need to be conscious of when we think about the EU. And third and finally, one division we can think about is social divisions. So again, bearing in mind that the EU is primarily an economic union, economic decisions, whether intended to or not, ultimately will bring about discussions of what is socially right and wrong. Should a member state be able to ban alcohol? Because banning alcohol ultimately is an economic measure. Should a member state be able to ban abortion, prostitution, soft drugs? These issues and these highly sensitive political areas create social divisions. One thing we see in the case law is, should we force member states to recognise same-sex marriage? Because some member states are fundamentally, at least in their constitution, opposed to same-sex marriage. However, if somebody from a country which does allow same-sex marriage wants to move to a country which doesn't, is it a hindrance on their freedom of movement if we don't force the second state to accept same-sex marriage? So again, this whole idea of an ever closer union really actually brings to the surface the divisions in Europe. Equally, we might say, well, if the EU is democratic because it gives citizens rights against the government, and if this set of institutions is to have any sort of moral backbone, maybe it should be forcing member states to make certain social decisions. Maybe it should be forcing equality legislation. Or maybe it simply doesn't have the authority to do so. And this, again, is a big question that we need to deal with. So these are some divisions which I would like to bring to your attention to think about when we look at other topics as well. And then there is discussion of Brexit. I won't go into merits or demerits of Brexit, but it's important to recognise that for British people, Brexit means one thing, but for residents of 27 other member states, it also means something. And even when we take economics and put them to one side, there is a political argument for Brexit which needs to be acknowledged and potentially respected. So, at its core, Brexit is the ultimate expression of state sovereignty. It is the clearest example of an EU member state in the history of the EU saying we are still a sovereign state and we will exercise our sovereignty as follows. We will potentially rip up our relationship with the EU and go it alone as what we are, a sovereign state. And this argument, it has lots of nuance to it, but fundamentally it is about saying that laws should be made in the UK and not in Brussels. And so many people who argue against Brexit say, well, look at these economic consequences and look at how it's going to affect individuals. Will they be richer or poorer? If they're poorer, easy answer, we should stay in the EU. However, it's not that simple, because sovereignty isn't really about economics. It's about feeling that you are able to influence the political destiny of your country. And so on that side of the debate, it is important to recognise that it's more nuanced than simply throwing statistics at people who want to leave the EU. Indeed, some people might want to leave the EU because it sees these divisions within Europe and sees them as irreconcilable, and so the EU might be a failed project. This is something we need to consider. But as I say, Brexit is just as much about 27 other member states as it is about the UK. And this is especially useful to consider when we think about the way in which the EU negotiates with the UK. So, let's kind of use this as a logical exercise. If a member state is still in the EU, it either historically or at the moment, in many cases at the moment, has a pro-European government. Some of them don't have pro-European governments, but we'll get to that. If the UK is able to leave the EU and do very well, it is logically the case that the pro-EU governments of the other 20 member states, there's 27 member states, may well come under increased pressure from opposition. Right? So, going back to the steps, 1, there is currently a pro-EU government. 2, if the EU doesn't look anymore, opposition parties, that is, anti-EU parties, will gain strength. 3, the end of the story is current leaders at EU level will lose elections. And it is important to consider this when we think about negotiation, because there is an incentive for the EU to make Brexit hard. And I did allude to the idea that some leaders of member states are not pro-EU. For example, the leader of Italy. However, again, if the EU wants to survive, it cannot make leaving easy. And we also need to think about it in terms of other member states who might want to leave, and really ask the question of whether other member states can leave. While it is incredibly difficult for the UK to leave the EU, it's important to also recognise that the UK is significantly less integrated into the EU than other member states. The biggest factor being that it hasn't joined the single currency. So for other member states, particularly debtor states, leaving the EU means much more, because it means leaving the euro, potentially, most likely they would leave the euro, annoying people you owe money to, but also going it alone as potentially an economically weaker state. And so it's important to consider when we consider Brexit, is it the case that Brexit is a one-off, or is it the case that other member states can leave? And if they can't leave, is this a problem? Because it means that actually maybe they're not real sovereign states, and maybe there's an element of imperialism from the EU. But of course this is all up for debate. But finally, I want to just highlight third state status. And this is the status given to countries which are not in the EU. For example, the USA, China, Switzerland. And one thing we find, especially when looking at the regulations of US goods made for export, is they may well follow EU regulations. Because if they don't follow EU regulations, they can't trade with the EU. And then we need to think, well, hang on. If the US and China still have to abide by EU regulations, not because they've signed any treaties, but because they want to trade, because there's an economic incentive to, is there really any leaving the EU? If the UK leaves the EU with a hard Brexit, and they still want to trade with the EU, they will have to follow some EU regulations. And so it's perhaps naive to think that adhering to these regulations comes and goes with joining the EU, because it doesn't. Switzerland, of course, is the biggest example of this, but I like to use the USA as a better one, because they are not historically, geographically connected to Europe. But economically, if they want to access this huge consumer market, they must adhere to regulations. And so the question is, can a country really separate itself from the EU? And potentially a point that some might make is, if we can't truly separate ourselves from the EU, in that we still have to follow their rules and regulations, does this argument from sovereignty, does it stand? And is there really any point to leaving? Maybe there's a point in principle that there's a difference between adhering to rules because you want to and because you have to, but again, we need to think whether this is a significant consideration for staying or going. I hope you liked the video, and if you did, I would really appreciate it if you liked the video. I will upload this as a picture and some notes in the description, and I hope to see you again next time.